There are big benefits to effective leadership, all right? Higher test scores, better school climate, lower teacher turnover, particularly among higher performing teachers and so forth, all right? And so we can see that, certainly we see that nationally, and we very clearly see that happening in the data that we have on what's going on in Tennessee schools as well, all right? Now, and I spent a little time talking about that because I want to tee up the second discussion, all right? And that is, if there are these big benefits to effective leaders, all right, if effective leaders are really helping to drive what's going on in terms of improvement across schools, then we need to ask the question, are we getting our best principals into the schools that need them most? So first, on the placement side, it is the case that less experienced and effective leaders, they do tend to be placed in less advantaged schools, and in particular, principals with more prior administrative experience, particularly experience as an AP, when they now move into a principal job, they tend to move into lower poverty schools, into higher achieving schools. It's also the case that leaders with higher prior team ratings, okay, and that's important, prior team ratings, so you were a principal before, or you were an AP before, so now I can see how you were rated in your prior job. People who did better, okay, who are more highly rated in their prior job, they tend to place into lower poverty and into higher achieving schools, all right? And the difference in that prior rating, okay, the difference in how that person did in their prior job between someone coming into a low poverty and a high poverty school is about half a team rating point. So, it's substantial, all right? And yet still I'll tell you that the placement story is less of the story than the turnover one, all right? The turnover issue, I would say, is the big one, all right? And thinking about what to do about leader turnover in the state is what I kind of want to end us on, all right? So these are principal turnover rates, again, broken down by those different poverty levels that I was talking about before, by school poverty. The overall is over here closest to me. And this is just showing you that the average turnover rate in high poverty schools is much higher. So the yearly average turnover rate for a low poverty school for principals is 15% compared to 19% for principals in high poverty schools. Again, not an urban phenomenon exclusively. The patterns are essentially the same as you go from urban, suburban, and if anything, the difference between low and high poverty schools in the rural districts in terms of principal turnover is even starker. You could do this by achievement. Again, the pattern is the same. You're all used to this now, so I don't have to stop and talk about it, but the patterns by achievement are the same, again, across the different locales. All right, and so what do those patterns tell us? Well, those patterns suggest three things. So the first one is we need to find ways to get better people into high-need schools, right? We need to really, I think, focus on how we can get more experienced and higher achieving principals into the schools that no doubt need them the most. We also need to find ways to keep principals in those schools, and that's really the key, I think, when we're looking at the turnover information. And so if we're going to figure out how to keep principals, how we're going to get those principals to stay in those high-need schools, well, then we need to know more about principal turnover in Tennessee. The principals who are the most likely to leave are the least effective ones, okay? But when I say leave, okay, turnover in that case are largely exits and demotions. And I think there's something positive there, all right? When principals aren't performing at a high level in the state of Tennessee, they will be more likely to exit the system altogether or for the system to move them into a non-principal position, okay? So that's the story on this end of the graph. What's interesting is as you move to the far end, as you get to the most effective set of principals, we also see that those principals have higher turnover rates. Those principals are also slightly more likely to exit, okay, to leave, and maybe they're more likely to leave because they've got other job opportunities, okay, and that's something I think we should think about. And they're also more likely to be promoted. In other words, they're more likely for the central office to pull them in, to move into district level leadership positions, and maybe one of the things that we could discuss in the panel is what the implications for that are. If we value high quality school leadership, do we get more from having those best leaders in central office? But how could we address principal turnover? Okay, going back to this sort of central question that I'm trying to motivate here, how could we think about how we address principal turnover, especially in our highest poverty and lowest achieving schools? Well, the first thing I think we have to do is prioritize stability, right? So showing you that lots of turnover is turnover within the school district, again, means that school districts have a big role to play, right? They have a lot of, they play a big role in decision making about principal placement. I think we can, when we get to the panel, I think that'll be a main question. How do we think about that? As school districts, should we be prioritizing stability? I would argue yes. That doesn't mean that, that principals always need to stay in the same school all the time. And how do you balance potentially different needs there when thinking about principal placement? The second thing is addressing working conditions. So one of the other things that we're doing is trying to look at survey data, because the Tennessee Educator Survey also asks lots of questions of principals to try to understand, well, what are the views and outlooks and perceptions of principals who turn over from year to year? And one of the things that we see from those data pretty clearly are principals report higher job satisfaction in relatively more advantaged schools, and those principals are also then more likely to stay in those schools. So how can we think about making strategies to make working conditions for principals more positive in those schools in order to give them incentives to stay? A third thing I think we could think a lot about is principal compensation. Across the state, we don't compensate principals very differently by characteristics of the schools that they work in, just as an empirical fact. So we can look at salary files of principals, and when we do that, we can adjust for principal experience and degree, the kinds of things that we often think of as being the determinants of educator salaries. And once we do that, we see that the salaries of principals in relatively advantaged and disadvantaged schools are practically the same. All right, which suggests that's a potential lever that could be pulled to differentiate compensation, to give principals incentives to stay in the neediest schools, particularly when those principals are the most effective.